And we have passed a special episode of another 3-day break for mental health purposes. Guys, I don't know how you feel out there, but I feel like the energies are crazy right now. And I also got my period. So we will not go into detail. We will, however, attempt to finish this book today. We are still reading Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden, and we are actually right now at chapter 33, and there are 35 chapters. So there's quite a lot to still read, but maybe you're up for it. I would be up to finish this book and then get started with a very interesting new one. So if you like what I'm doing, a thumbs up would help. And a follow will ensure that if I don't stick to my schedule of being online every day, you will not miss any live that I will do because you're getting a information about it. So let's dive straight in. And then maybe tomorrow we can start with a new book. I already have one in store. I hope you will like that too. So, chapter 33. That very night, while I lay on my futon with the room swaying around me, I made up my mind to be like the fisherman who hour after hour scoops out fish with his net. Whenever thoughts of the chairman drifted up from within me, I would scoop them out and scoop them out again and again until none of them were left. It would have been a clever system, I'm sure, if I could have made it work. But when I had even a single thought of him, I could never catch it before it sped away and carried me to the very place from which I'd banished my thoughts. Many times I stopped myself and said, "Don't think of the chairman. Think of Nobu instead." And very deliberately, I pictured myself meeting Nobu somewhere in Kyoto. But then something always went wrong. The spot I pictured might be where I'd often imagined myself encountering the chairman. And then, in an instant, I was lost in thoughts of the chairman once again. I went on this way for weeks, trying to remake myself. Sometimes when I was free for a while from thinking about the chairman, I began to feel as if a pit had opened up within me. I had no appetite even when little Itsuko came late at night carrying me a bowl of clear broth. A few times I did manage to focus my mind clearly on Nobu. I grew so numbed I seemed to feel nothing at all. While putting on my makeup, my face hung like a kimono from a rod. Auntie told me I looked like a ghost. I went to parties and banquets as usual, but I knelt in silence with my hands in my lap. I knew Nobu was on the point of proposing himself as my Dana, and so I waited every day for the news to reach me. But the weeks dragged on without any word. Then, one hot afternoon at the end of June, nearly a month after I'd given back the rock, Mother brought in a newspaper while I was eating lunch and opened it to show me an article entitled "Iwamura Electric Secures Financing from Mitsubishi Bank." I expected to find all sorts of references to Nobu and the minister, and certainly to the chairman, but mostly the article gave a lot of information I can't even remember. It told that Iwamura Electric's designation had been changed by the Allied occupation authorities from, I don't remember, a class something to a class something else, which meant, as the article went on to explain, that the company was no longer restricted from entering into contracts, applying for loans and so forth. Several paragraphs followed, all about rates of interest and lines of credit, and then finally about a very large loan secured the day before from the Mitsubishi Bank. It was a difficult article to read, full of numbers and business terms. When I finished, I looked up at Mother, kneeling on the other side of the table. "Iwamura Electric's fortunes have turned around completely," she said. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" "Mother, I hardly even understand what I've just read." "It's no wonder we've heard so much from Nobu Toshikatsu these past few days. You must know he's proposed himself as your Dana. I was thinking of turning him down. Who wants a man with an uncertain future? Now I can see why you've seemed so distracted these past few weeks. Well, you can relax now. It's finally happening. We all know how fond you've been of Nobu these many years. I went on, gazing down at the table just like a proper daughter. But I'm sure I wore a pained expression on my face, because in a moment Mother went on, "You mustn't be listless this way when Nobu wants you in his bed. Perhaps your health isn't what it should be. I'll send you to a doctor the moment you return from Amami." The only Amami I'd ever heard of was a little island not far from Okinawa. I couldn't imagine this was the place she meant. But in fact, as Mother went on to tell me, the mistress of the Ishiriki had received a telephone call that very morning from Iwamura Electric concerning a trip to the island of Amami the following weekend. I'd been asked to go along with Mamea and Pumpkin and also another geisha whose name Mother couldn't remember. We would leave the following Friday afternoon. "But, Mother, it makes no sense at all," I said. "A weekend trip as far as Amami. The boat ride alone will take all day." "Nothing of the sort. Iwamura Electric has arranged for all of you to travel there in an airplane." In an instant, I forgot my worries about Nobu and sat upright as quickly as if someone had poked me with a pin. "Mother," I said, "I can't possibly fly on an airplane." "If you're sitting in one and the thing takes off, you won't be able to help it," she replied. She must have thought her little joke was very funny, because she gave one of her huffing laughs. With gasoline so scarce, there couldn't possibly be an airplane, I decided, so I made up my mind not to worry. And this worked well for me until the following day, when I spoke with the mistress of the Ishiriki. It seemed that several American officers on the island of Okinawa traveled by air to Osaka several weekends a month. Normally, the airplane flew home empty and returned a few days later to pick them up. Iwamura Electric had arranged for our group to ride on the return trips. We were going to Amami only because the empty airplane was available. Otherwise, we'd probably have been on our way to a hot springs resort and not fearing for our lives at all. The last thing the mistress said to me was, "I'm just grateful it's you and not me flying in the thing." When Friday morning came, we set out for Osaka by train. In addition to Mr. Beku, who came to help us with our trunks and as far as the airport, the little group consisted of Mamea, Pumpkin and me, as well as an elderly geisha named Shizue. Shizue was from the Pontocho district rather than Gion and had unattractive glasses and silver hair that made her look even older than she really was. What was worse, her chin had a big cleft in the middle, like two breasts. Shizue seemed to view the rest of us as a cedar views the weeds growing beneath it. Mostly she stared out the window of the train, but every so often she opened the clasp of her orange and red handbag to take out a piece of candy and looked at us as if she couldn't see why we had to trouble her with our presence. From Osaka station, we traveled to the airport in a little bus, not much larger than a car, which ran on coal and was very dirty. At last, after an hour or so, we climbed down beside a silver airplane with two great big propellers on the wings. I wasn't at all reassured to see the tiny wheel on which the tail rested, and when we went inside, the aisle sloped downwards so dramatically I felt sure the plane was broken. The men were on board already, sitting in the seats at the rear and talking business. In addition to the chairman and Nobu, the minister was there, as well as an elderly man who, as I later learned, was regional director of the Mitsubishi Bank. Seated beside him was a man in his 30s with a chin just like Shizue's, and glasses as thick as hers too. As it turned out, Shizue was the longtime mistress of the bank director, and this man was their son. We sat toward the front of the airplane and left the men to their dull conversation. Soon I heard a coughing noise and the airplane trembled. And when I looked out the window, the giant propeller outside had begun to turn. In a matter of moments, it was whirling its sword-like blades inches from my face, making the most desperate humming noise. I felt sure it would come tearing through the side of the airplane and slice me in half. Mamea had put me in a window seat, thinking the view might calm me once we were airborne, but now that she saw what the propeller was doing, she refused to switch seats with me. The noise of the engines grew worse and the airplane began to bump along, turning here and there. Finally, the noise reached its most terrifying volume yet, and the aisle tipped level. After another few moments, we heard a thump and began to rise up into the air. Only when the ground was far below us did someone finally tell me the trip was 700 kilometers and would take nearly 4 hours. When I heard this, I'm afraid my eyes glazed over with tears and everyone began to laugh at me. I pulled the curtains over the window and tried to calm myself by reading a magazine. Quite some time later, after Mamea had fallen asleep in the seat beside me, I looked up to find Nobu standing in the aisle. "Sayuri, are you well?" he said, speaking quietly so as not to wake Mamea. "I don't think Nobu-san has ever asked me such a thing before," I said. "He must be in a very cheerful mood." "The future has never looked more promising." Mamea stirred at the sound of our talking, so Nobu said nothing further and instead continued up the aisle to the toilet. Just before opening the door, he glanced back toward where the other men were seated. For an instant, I saw him from an angle I'd rarely seen, which gave him a look of fierce concentration. When his glance flicked in my direction, I thought he might pick up some hint that I felt as worried about my future as he felt reassured about his. How strange it seemed, when I thought about it, that Nobu understood me so little. Of course, a geisha who expects understanding from her Dana is like a mouse expecting sympathy from the snake. And in any case, how could Nobu possibly understand anything about me when he'd seen me solely as a geisha, keeping my true self carefully concealed? The chairman was the only man I'd ever entertained as Sayuri, the geisha who had also known me as Chiyo. Though it was strange to think of it this way, for I'd never realized it before. What would Nobu have done if he had been the one to find me that day at the Shirakawa stream? Surely he would have walked right past, and how much easier it might have been for me if he had. I wouldn't spend my nights yearning for the chairman. I wouldn't stop in cosmetics shops from time to time to smell the scent of talc in the air and remind myself of his skin. I wouldn't strain to picture his presence beside me in some imaginary place. If you'd asked me why I wanted these things, I would have answered, why does a ripe persimmon taste delicious? Why does wood smell smoky when it burns? But here I was again, like a girl trying to catch mice with her hands. Why couldn't I stop thinking about the chairman? I'm sure my anguish must have shown clearly on my face when the door to the toilet opened a moment later and the light snapped off. I couldn't bear for Nobu to see me this way, so I laid my head against the window, pretending to be asleep. After he passed by, I opened my eyes again. I found that the position of my head had caused the curtains to pull open, so that I was looking outside the airplane for the first time since shortly after we'd lifted off the runway. Spread out below was a broad vista of aqua blue ocean, mottled with the same jade green as a certain hair ornament Mamea sometimes wore. I'd never imagined the ocean with patches of green. From the sea cliffs in Yoruido, it had always looked the color of slate. Here, the sea stretched all the way out to a single line pulled across like a wool thread where the sky began. This view wasn't frightening at all, but inexpressibly lovely. Even the hazy disk of the propeller was beautiful in its own way, and the silver wing had a kind of magnificence and was decorated with those symbols that American warplanes have on them. Was to see them there, considering the world only 5 years earlier. We had fought a brutal war as enemies, and now what? We had given up our past. This was something I understood fully, for I had done it myself once. If only I could find a way of giving up my future. And then a frightening image came to mind. I saw myself cutting the bond of fate that held me to Nobu, and watching him fall all the long way into the ocean below. I don't mean this was just an idea or some sort of daydream. I mean that all at once I understood exactly how to do it. Of course, I wasn't really going to throw Nobu into the ocean, but I did have an understanding, just as clearly as if a window had been thrown open in my mind, of the one thing I could do to end my relationship with him forever. I didn't want to lose his friendship, but in my efforts to reach the chairman, Nobu was an obstacle I'd found no way around. And yet, I could cause him to be consumed by the flames of his own anger. Nobu himself had told me how to do it, just a moment after cutting his hand that night at the Ishiriki tea house only a few weeks. If I was the sort of woman who would give myself to the minister, he wanted me to leave the room right then and would never speak to me again. The feeling that came over me as I thought of this, it was like a fever breaking. I felt damp everywhere on my body. I was grateful Mamea remained asleep beside me. I'm sure she would have wondered what was the matter, to see me short of breath wiping my forehead with my fingertips. This idea that had come to me, could I really do such a thing? I don't mean the act of seducing the minister. I knew perfectly well I could do that. It would be like going to the doctor for a shot. I'd look the other way for a time and it would be over. But could I do such a thing to Nobu? What a horrible way to repay his kindness. Compared with the sorts of men so many geisha had suffered through the years, Nobu was probably a very desirable Dana. But could I bear to live a life in which my hopes had been extinguished forever? For weeks I'd been working to convince myself I could live it. But could I really? I thought perhaps I understood how Hatsumomo had come by her bitter cruelty, and Granny her meanness. Even Pumpkin, who was scarcely 30, had worn a look of disappointment for many years. The only thing that had kept me from it was hope. And now, to sustain my hopes, would I commit an abhorrent act? And I'm not talking about seducing the minister. I'm talking about betraying Nobu's trust. During the rest of the flight, I struggled with these thoughts. I could never have imagined myself scheming in this way, but in time I began to imagine the steps involved, just like in a board game. I would draw the minister aside at the inn. No, not the inn, at some other place. And I would trick Nobu into stumbling upon us. Or perhaps it would be enough for him to hear it from someone else. You can imagine how exhausted I felt by the end of the trip. Even as we left the airplane, I must still have looked very worried because Mamea kept reassuring me that the flight was over and I was safe at last. We arrived at our inn about an hour before sunset. The others admired the room in which we would all be staying, but I felt so agitated I could only pretend to admire it. It was as spacious as the largest room at the Ishiriki tea house, and furnished beautifully in the Japanese style with tatami mats and gleaming wood. One long wall was made entirely of glass doors, beyond which lay extraordinary tropical plants, some with leaves nearly as big as a man. A covered walkway led down through the leaves to the banks of a stream. When the luggage was in order, we were all of us quite ready for a bath. The inn had provided folding screens, which we opened in the middle of the room for privacy. We changed into our cotton gowns and made our way along a succession of covered walkways, leading through the dense foliage to a luxurious hot springs pool at the other end of the inn. The men's and women's entrances were shielded by partitions and had separate tiled areas for washing. But once we were immersed in the dark water of the springs and moved out beyond the partition's edge, the men and women were together in the water. The bank director kept making jokes about Mamea and me, saying he wanted one of us to fetch a certain pebble or twig or something of the sort from the woods at the edge of the springs. The joke being, of course, that he wanted to see us naked. All this while, his son was engrossed in conversation with Pumpkin, and it didn't take us long to understand why Pumpkin's bosoms, which were fairly large, kept floating up and exposing themselves on the surface while she jabbered away as always without noticing. Perhaps it seems odd to you that we all bathed together, men and women, and that we planned to sleep in the same room later that night, but actually, geisha do this sort of thing all the time with their best customers, or at least they did in my day. A single geisha who values her reputation will certainly never be caught alone with a man who isn't her dana. But to bathe innocently in a group like this, with the murky water cloaking us, that's quite another matter. And as for sleeping in a group, we even have a word for it in Japanese. Tsakone, fish sleeping. If you picture a bunch of mackerel thrown together into a basket, I suppose that's what it means. Bathing in a group like this was innocent, as I say, but that doesn't mean a hand never strayed where it shouldn't, and this thought was very much on my mind as I soaked there in the hot springs. If Nobu had been the sort of man to tease, he might have drifted over toward me, and then, after we'd chatted for a time, he might suddenly have grabbed me by the hip or, well, almost anywhere, to tell the truth. The proper next step would be for me to scream and Nobu to laugh, and that would be the end of it. But Nobu wasn't the sort of man to tease. He'd been immersed in the bath for a time, in conversation with the chairman, but now he was sitting on a rock with only his legs in the water and a small wet towel draped across his hips. He wasn't paying attention to the rest of us, but rubbing at the stump of his arm absent-mindedly and peering into the water. The sun had set by now, and the light faded almost to evening, but Nobu sat in the brightness of a paper lantern. I'd never before seen him so exposed. The scarring that I thought was at its worst on one side of his face was every bit as bad on his damaged shoulder, though his other shoulder was beautifully smooth like an egg. And now to think that I was considering betraying him. He would think I had done it for only one reason, and would never understand the truth. I couldn't bear the thought of hurting Nobu or of destroying his regard for me. I wasn't at all sure I could go through with it. After breakfast the following morning, we all took a walk through the tropical forest to the sea cliffs nearby, where the stream from our inn poured over a picturesque little waterfall into the ocean. We stood a long while admiring the view. Even when we were all ready to leave, the chairman could hardly tear himself away. On the return trip, I walked beside Nobu, who was still as cheerful as I'd ever seen him. Afterward, we toured the island in the back of a military truck fitted with benches and saw bananas and pineapples growing on the trees and beautiful birds. From the mountaintops, the ocean looked like a crumpled blanket in turquoise with stains of dark blue. That afternoon, we wandered the Evidently, it had at one time been a warehouse, but now was the town's theater. When I first stepped inside, I didn't think very much about it, but after the door banged shut and we'd made our way to the street again, I began to feel that same feeling of a fever breaking, because in my mind I had an image of myself lying there on the rotted flooring with the minister as the door creaked open and sunlight fell across us. We would have no place to hide. Nobu couldn't possibly fail to see us. In many ways, I'm sure it was the very spot I'd half hoped to find. But I wasn't thinking of these things. I wasn't really thinking at all, so much as struggling to put my thoughts into some kind of order. They felt to me like rice pouring from a torn sack. As we walked back up the hill toward our inn, I had to fall back from the group to take my handkerchief from my sleeve. It was certainly very warm there on that road, with the afternoon sun shining full onto our faces. I wasn't the only one perspiring, but Nobu came walking back to ask if I was all right. When I couldn't manage to answer him right away, I hoped he would think it was the strain of walking up the hill. "You haven't looked well all weekend, Sayuri. Perhaps you ought to have stayed in Kyoto." "But when would I have seen this beautiful island?" "I'm sure this is the farthest you've ever been from your home. We're as far from Kyoto now as Hokkaido is." The others had walked around the bend ahead. Over Nobu's shoulder I could see the eaves of the inn protruding above the foliage. I wanted to reply to him, but I found myself consumed with the same thoughts that had troubled me on the airplane, that Nobu didn't understand me at all. Kyoto wasn't my home, not in the sense Nobu seemed to mean it, of a place where I'd been raised, a place I'd never strayed from. And in that instant, while I peered at him in the hot sun, I made up my mind that I would do this thing I had feared. I would betray Nobu, even though he stood there looking at me with kindness. I tucked away my handkerchief with trembling hands, and we continued up the hill, not speaking a word. By the time I reached the room, the chairman and Mamea had already taken seats at the table to begin a game of Go against the bank director, with Shizue and her son looking on. The glass doors along the far wall stood open. The minister was propped on one elbow, staring out, peeling the covering off a short stalk of cane he'd brought back with him. I was desperately afraid Nobu would engage me in a conversation I'd be unable to escape, but in fact, he went directly over to the table and began talking with Mamiya. I had no idea as yet how I would lure the minister to the theater with me, and even less idea how I would arrange for Nobu to find us there. Perhaps Pumpkin would take Nobu for a walk if I asked her to? I didn't feel I could ask such a thing of Mamiya, but Pumpkin and I had been girls together, and though I won't call her crude, as Auntie had called her, Pumpkin did have a certain coarseness in her personality and would be less aghast at what I was planning. I would need to direct her explicitly to bring Nobu to the old theater. They wouldn't come upon us there purely by accident. For a time I knelt gazing out at the sunlit leaves and wishing I could appreciate the beautiful tropical afternoon. I kept asking myself whether I was fully sane to be considering this plan. But whatever misgivings I might have felt, they weren't enough to stop me from going ahead with it. Clearly nothing would happen until I succeeded in drawing the minister aside, and I couldn't afford to call attention to myself when I did it. Earlier, he'd asked a maid to bring him a snack, and now he was sitting with his legs around the tray, pouring beer into his mouth and dropping in globs of salted squid guts with his chopsticks. This may seem like a nauseating idea for a dish, but I can assure you that you'll find salted squid guts in bars and restaurants here and there in Japan. It was a favorite of my father's, but I've never been able to stomach it. I couldn't even watch the minister as he ate. "Minister," I said to him quietly, "would you like me to find you something more appetizing?" "No," he said, "I'm not hungry." I must admit this raised in my mind the question of why he was eating in the first place. By now Mamiya and Nobu had wandered out the back door in conversation, and the others, including Pumpkin, were gathered around the go board on the table. Apparently, the chairman had just made a blunder, and they were laughing. It seemed to me my chance had come. "If you're eating out of boredom, Minister," I said, "why don't you and I explore the inn? I've been eager to see it, and we haven't had the time." I didn't wait for him to reply, but stood and walked from the room. I was relieved when he stepped out into the hallway a moment later to join me. We walked in silence down the corridor until we came to a bend where I could see that no one was coming from either direction. I stopped. "Minister, excuse me," I said, "but shall we take a walk back down to the village together?" He looked very confused by this. "We have an hour or so left in the afternoon," I went on, "and I remember something I'd very much like to see again." After a long pause, the minister said, "I'll need to use the toilet first." "Yes, that's fine," I told him. "You go and use the toilet, and when you're finished, wait right here for me and we'll take a walk together. Don't go anywhere until I come and fetch you." The minister seemed agreeable to this and continued up the corridor. I went back toward the room, and I felt so dazed now that I was actually going through with my plan that when I put my hand on the door to slide it open, I could scarcely feel my fingers touching anything at all. Pumpkin was no longer at the table. She was looking through her travel trunk for something. At first, when I tried to speak, nothing came out. I had to clear my throat and try again. Excuse me, Pumpkin, I said. Just one moment of your time. She didn't look eager to stop what she was doing, but she left her trunk in disarray and came out into the hallway with me. I led her some distance down the corridor and then turned to her and said, Pumpkin, I need to ask a favor. I waited for her to tell me she was happy to help, but she just stood there with her eyes on me. I hope you won't mind my asking. Ask, she said. The minister and I are about to go for a walk. I'm going to take him to the old theatre and... Why? So that he and I can be alone. The minister? Pumpkin said incredulously. I'll explain some other time, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to bring Noble there, and Pumpkin, this will sound very strange. I want you to discover us. What do you mean, discover you? I want you to find some way of bringing Noble there and opening the back door we saw earlier so that he'll see us. While I was speaking this, Pumpkin had noticed the minister waiting in another covered walkway through the foliage. Now she looked back at me. What are you up to, Sayuri? She said. I don't have time to explain it now, but it's terribly important, Pumpkin. Truthfully, my entire future is in your hands. Just make sure it's no one but you and Nobu, not the chairman, for heaven's sake, or anyone else. I'll repay you in any way you'd like. She looked at me for a long moment. So it's time for a favor from Pumpkin again, is it? She said. I didn't feel certain what she meant by this, but rather than explaining it to me, she left. I wasn't sure whether or not Pumpkin had agreed to help, but all I could do at this point was go to the doctor for my shot, so to speak, and hope that she and Noble would appear. I joined the minister in the corridor and we set out down the hill. As we walked around the bend in the road and left the inn behind us, I couldn't help remembering the day Mamea had cut me on the leg and taken me to meet Dr. Crab. On that afternoon, I'd felt myself in some sort of danger I couldn't fully understand, and I felt much the same way now. My face was as hot in the afternoon sun as if I'd sat too close to the hibachi, and when I looked at the minister, sweat was running down his temple onto his neck. If all went well, he would soon be pressing that neck against me. And at this thought, I took my folding fan from my obi and waved it until my arm was tired, trying to cool both myself and him. All the while, I kept up a flow of conversation until a few minutes later, when we came to a stop before the old theatre with its thatched roof. The minister seemed puzzled. He cleared his throat and looked up at the sky. Will you come inside with me for a moment, minister? I said. He didn't seem to know what to make of this, but when I walked down the path beside the building, he plodded along behind me. I climbed the stone steps and opened the door for him. He hesitated only a moment before walking inside. If he had frequented Gion all his life, he'd certainly have understood what I had in mind, because a geisha who lures a man to an isolated spot has certainly put her reputation at stake, and a first-class geisha will never do such a thing casually. But the minister just stood inside the theatre, in the patch of sunlight, like a man waiting for a bus. My hands were trembling so much as I folded my fan and tucked it into my obi again. I wasn't at all certain I could see my plan through to the end. The simple act of closing the door took all my strength, and then we were standing in the murky light filtering under the eaves. Still, the minister stood inert, with his face pointed toward a stack of straw mats in the corner of the stage. Minister, I said. My voice echoed so much in the little hall, I spoke more quietly afterward. I understand you had a talk with the mistress of the Ishiriki about me. Isn't that so? He took in a deep breath, but ended up saying nothing. Minister, if I may, I said, I'd like to tell you a story about a geisha named Kasuyo. She isn't in Gion any longer, but I knew her well at one time. A very important man, much like you, Minister, met Kazuyo one evening and enjoyed her company so much that he came back to Gion every night to see her. After a few months of this, he asked to be Kazuyo's Dana, but the mistress of the tea house apologized and said it wouldn't be possible. The man was very disappointed, but then one afternoon Kazuyo took him to a quiet spot where they could be alone. Some place very much like this empty theater, and she explained to him that even though he couldn't be her Dana. The moment I said these last words, the minister's face changed like a valley when the clouds move away and sunlight rushes across it. He took a clumsy step toward me. At once my heart began to pound like drums in my ears. I couldn't help looking away from him and closing my eyes. When I opened them again, the minister had come so close we were nearly touching, and then I felt the damp fleshiness of his face against my cheek. Slowly he brought his body toward mine until we were pressed together. He took my arms, probably to pull me down onto the planking, but I stopped him. "The stage is too dusty," I said. "You must bring over a mat from that stack." "We'll go over there," the minister replied. If we had lain down upon the mats in the corner, Nobu wouldn't have seen us in the sunlight when he opened the door. "No, we mustn't," I said. "Please, bring a mat here." The minister did as I asked, and then stood with his hands by his side, watching me. Until this moment, I'd half imagined something would stop us, but now I could see that nothing would. Time seemed to slow. My feet looked to me like someone else's when they stepped out of my lacquered zori and onto the mat. Almost at once, the minister kicked off his shoes and was against me, with his arms around me tugging at the knot in my obi. I didn't know what he was thinking, because I certainly wasn't prepared to take off my kimono. I reached back to stop him. When I'd dressed that morning, I still hadn't quite made up my mind, but in order to be prepared, I'd very deliberately put on a grey underrobe I didn't much like, thinking it might be stained before the end of the day, and a lavender and blue kimono of silk gauze, as well as a durable silver obi. As for my undergarments, I'd shortened my koshimaki, my hip wrap, by rolling it at the waist so that if I decided after all to seduce the minister, he'd have no trouble finding his way inside it. Now, when I withdrew his hands from around me, he gave me a puzzled look. I think he believed I was stopping him, and he looked very relieved as I lay down on the mat. It wasn't a tatami, but a simple sheet of woven straw. I could feel the hard flooring beneath. With one hand, I folded back my kimono and underrobe on one side so that my leg was exposed to the knee. The minister was still fully dressed, but he lay down upon me at once, pressing the knot of my obi into my back so much I had to raise one hip to make myself more comfortable. My head was turned to the side as well, because I was wearing my hair in a style known as tsubushi shimada, with a dramatic chignon looped in the back, which would have been ruined if I'd put any weight on it. It was certainly an uncomfortable arrangement, but my discomfort was nothing compared with the uneasiness and anxiety I felt. Suddenly I wondered if I'd been thinking at all clearly when I'd put myself in this predicament. The minister raised himself on one arm and began fumbling inside the seam of my kimono with his hand, scratching my thighs with his fingernails. Without thinking about what I was doing, I brought my hands up to his shoulders to push him away. But then I imagined Nobu as my Dana, and the life I would live without hope, and I took my hands away and settled them onto the mat again. The minister's fingers were squirming higher and higher along the inside of my thigh. It was impossible not to feel them. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the door. Perhaps it would open even now, before the minister had gone any further. But at that moment I heard the jingling of his belt and then the zip of his pants, and a moment later he was forcing himself inside me. Somehow I felt like a 15-year-old girl again, because the feeling was so strangely reminiscent of Dr. Crab. I even heard myself whimper. The minister was holding himself up on his elbows with his face above mine. I could see him out of only one corner of my eye. When viewed up close like this, with his jaw protruding toward me, he looked more like an animal than a human. And even this wasn't the worst part, for with his jaw jutted forward, the minister's lower lip became like a cup in which his saliva began to pool. I don't know if it was the squid guts he'd eaten, but his saliva had a kind of grey thickness to it, which made me think of the residue left on the cutting board after fish have been cleaned. When I'd dressed that morning, I'd tucked the several sheets of a very absorbent rice paper into the back of my obi. I hadn't expected to need them until afterward, when the minister would want them for wiping himself off. If I decided to go through with it, that is. Now, it seemed I would need a sheet much sooner to wipe my face when his saliva spilled onto me. With so much of his weight on my hips, however, I couldn't get my hand into the back of my obi. I let out several little gasps as I tried, and I'm afraid the minister mistook them for excitement, for in any case, he suddenly grew even more energetic, and now the pool of saliva in his lip was being jostled with such violent shock waves I could hardly believe it held together rather than spilling out in a stream. All I could do was pinch my eyes shut and wait. I felt as sick as if I had been lying in the bottom of a little boat, tossed about on the waves, and with my head banging again and again against the side. Then, all at once, the minister made a groaning noise and held very still for a bit, and at the same time I felt his saliva spill onto my cheek. I tried again to reach the rice paper in my obi, but now the minister was lying collapsed upon me, breathing as heavily as if he'd just run a race. I was about to push him off when I heard a scraping sound outside. My feelings of disgust had been so loud within me they'd nearly drowned out everything else. But now that I remembered Nobu, I could feel my heart pounding once again. I heard another scrape. It was the sound of someone on the stone steps. The minister seemed to have no idea what was about to happen to him. He raised his head and pointed it toward the door with only the mildest interest, as if he expected to see a bird there. And then the door creaked open and the sunlight flooded over us. I had to squint, but I could make out two figures. There was Pumpkin. She had come to the theater just as I'd hoped she would, but the man peering down from beside her wasn't Nobu at all. I had no notion of why she had done it, but Pumpkin had brought the chairman instead. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Technically I know what happens, but oh my goodness. Okay. Chapter 34. I can scarcely remember anything after that door opened, for I think the blood may have drained out of me. I went so cold and numb. I know the minister climbed off me, or perhaps I pushed him off. I do remember weeping and asking if he'd seen the same thing I had, whether it really had been the chairman standing there in the doorway. I hadn't been able to make out anything of the chairman's expression, with the late afternoon sun behind him. And yet, when the door closed again, I couldn't help imagining I'd seen on his face some of the shock I myself was feeling. I didn't know if the shock was really there, and I doubted it was. But when we feel pain, even the blossoming trees seem weighed with suffering to us. And in just the same way, after seeing the chairman there, well, I would have found my own pain reflected on anything I'd looked at. If you consider that I'd taken the minister to that empty theater for the very purpose of putting myself in danger, so that the knife would come slamming down onto the chopping block, so to speak, I'm sure you'll understand that amid the worry and fear and disgust that almost overwhelmed me, I'd also been feeling a certain excitement. In the instant before that door opened, I could almost sense my life expanding just like a river whose waters have begun to swell, for I had never before taken such a drastic step to change the course of my own future. I was like a child tiptoeing along a precipice overlooking the sea, and yet somehow I hadn't imagined a great wave might come and strike me there and wash everything away. When the chaos of feelings receded and I slowly became aware of myself again, Mamea was kneeling above me. I was puzzled to find that I wasn't in the old theater at all any longer, but rather looking up from the tatami floor of a dark little room at the inn. I don't recall anything about leaving the theater, but I must have done it somehow. Later, Mamea told me I'd gone to the proprietor to ask for a quiet place to rest. He'd recognized that I wasn't feeling well and had gone to find Mamea soon afterward. Fortunately, Mamea seemed willing to believe I was truly ill and left me there. Later, as I wandered back toward the room in a daze and with a terrible feeling of dread, I saw Pumpkin step out into the covered walkway ahead of me. She stopped when she caught sight of me, but rather than hurrying over to apologize, as I half expected she might, she turned her focus slowly toward me like a snake that had spotted a mouse. "Pumpkin," I said, "I asked you to bring Nobu, not the chairman. I don't understand." "Yes, it must be hard for you to understand, Sayuri, when life doesn't work out perfectly." "Perfectly? Nothing worse could have happened. Did you misunderstand what I was asking you?" "You really do think I'm stupid," she said. I was bewildered and stood a long moment in silence. "I thought you were my friend," I said at last. "I thought you were my friend too once, but that was a long time ago." "You talk as if I've done something to harm you, Pumpkin, but—" "No, you'd never do anything like that, would you? Not the perfect Miss Nita Sayuri. I suppose it doesn't matter what you took my place as the daughter of the Okiya. Do you remember that, Sayuri? After I'd gone out of my way to help you with that doctor, whatever his name was, and after I'd risked making Hatsumomo furious at me for helping you, then you turned it all around and stole what was mine. I've been wondering all these months just why you brought me into this little gathering with the minister. I'm sorry it wasn't so easy for you to take advantage of me this time." "But, Pumpkin," I interrupted, "couldn't you just have refused to help me? Why did you have to bring the chairman?" She stood up to her full height. "I know perfectly well how you feel about him," she said. "Whenever there's nobody looking, your eyes hang all over him like fur on a dog." She was so angry she had bitten her lip. I could see a smudge of lipstick on her teeth. She'd set out to hurt me, I now realized, and the worst way she could. "You took something from me a long time ago, Sayuri. How does it feel now?" she said. Her nostrils were flared, her face consumed with anger like a burning twig. It was as though the spirit of Hatsumomo had been living trapped inside her all these years and had finally broken free. During the rest of that evening, I remember nothing but a blur of events and how much I dreaded every moment ahead of me. While the others sat around drinking and laughing, it was all I could do to pretend to laugh. I must have spent the entire night flushed red, because from time to time Mamiya touched my neck to see if I was feverish. I'd seated myself as far away from the chairman as I could, so that our eyes would never have to meet, and I did manage to make it through the evening without confronting him. But later, as we were all preparing for bed, I stepped into the hallway as he was coming back into the room. I ought to have moved out of his way, but I felt so ashamed. I gave a brief bow and hurried past him instead, making no effort to hide my unhappiness. It was an evening of torment, and I remember only one other thing about it. At some point, after everyone else was asleep, I wandered away from the inn in a daze and ended up on the sea cliffs, staring out into the darkness with the sound of the roaring water below me. The thundering of the ocean was like a bitter lament. I seemed to see beneath everything a layering of cruelty I'd never known was there, as though the trees and the wind and even the rocks where I stood were all in alliance with my old girlhood enemy, Hatsumomo. The howling of the wind and the shaking of the trees seemed to mock me. Could it really be that the stream of my life had divided forever? I removed the chairman's handkerchief from my sleeve, for I'd taken it to bed that evening to comfort myself one last time. I dried my face with it and held it up into the wind. I was about to let it dance away into the darkness when I thought of the tiny mortuary tablets that Mr. Tanaka had sent me so many years earlier. We must always keep something to remember those who have left us. The mortuary tablets back in the Okiya were all that remained of my childhood. The chairman's handkerchief would be what remained of the rest of my life. Back in Kyoto, I was carried along in a current of activity over the next few days. I had no choice but to put on my makeup as usual and attend engagements at the tea houses just as though nothing had changed in the world. I kept reminding myself what Mame had once told me, that there was nothing like work for getting over a disappointment, but my work didn't seem to help me in any way. Every time I went into the Ishiriki tea house, I was reminded that one day soon, Nobu would summon me there to tell me the arrangements had been settled at last. Considering how busy he'd been over the past few months, I didn't expect to hear from him for some time, a week or two perhaps. But on Wednesday morning, 3 days after our return from Amami, I received word that Iwamura Electric had telephoned the Ishiriki tea house to request my presence that evening. I dressed late in the afternoon in a yellow kimono of silk gauze with a green underrobe and a deep blue obi interwoven with gold threads. Auntie assured me I looked lovely, but when I saw myself in the mirror, I seemed like a woman defeated. I'd certainly experienced moments in the past when I felt displeased with the way I looked before setting out from the Okiya, but most often I managed to find at least one feature I could make use of during the course of the evening. A certain persimmon-colored underrobe, for example, always brought out the blue in my eyes, rather than the grey, no matter how exhausted I felt. But this evening my face seemed utterly hollow beneath my cheekbones, although I'd put on Western-style makeup just as I usually did, and even my hairstyle seemed lopsided to me. I couldn't think of any way to improve my appearance other than asking Mr. Baku to retie my obi just a finger's width higher to take away some of my downcast look. My first engagement was a banquet given by an American colonel to honor the new governor of Kyoto Prefecture. It was held at the former estate of the Sumitomo family, which was now the headquarters of the American Army's 7th Division. I was amazed to see that so many of the beautiful stones in the garden were painted white, and signs in English, which of course I couldn't read, were tacked to the trees here and there. After the party was over, I made my way to the Ishiriki and was shown upstairs by a maid to the same peculiar little room where Nobu had met with me on the night Gion was closing. This was the very spot where I'd learned about the heaven he'd found to keep me safe from the war. It seemed entirely appropriate that we should meet in this same room to celebrate his becoming my Dana, though it would be anything but a celebration for me. I knelt at one end of the table so that Nobu would sit facing the alcove. I was careful to position myself so he could pour sake using his one arm without the table in his way. He would certainly want to pour a cup for me after telling me the arrangements had been finalized. It would be a fine night for Nobu. I would do my best not to spoil it. With the dim lighting and the reddish cast from the tea-colored walls, the atmosphere was really quite pleasant. I'd forgotten the very particular scent of the room, a combination of dust and the oil used for polishing wood. But now that I smelled it again, I found myself remembering details about that evening with Nobu years earlier that I couldn't possibly have called to mind otherwise. He'd had holes in both of his socks, I remembered. Through one, a slender big toe had protruded, with the nail neatly groomed. Could it really be that only 5.5 years had passed since that evening? It seemed an entire generation had come and gone. So many of the people I'd once known were dead. Was this the life I'd come back to Gion to lead? It was just as Mamea had once told me. We don't become geisha because we want our lives to be happy. We become geisha because we have no choice. If my mother had lived, I might be a wife and mother at the seashore myself, thinking of Kyoto as a faraway place where the fish were shipped. And would my life really be any worse? Nobu had once said to me, "I'm a very easy man to understand, Sayuri. I don't like things held up before me that I cannot have." Perhaps I was just the same. All my life in Gion, I'd imagined the chairman before me, and now I could not have him. After 10 or 15 minutes of waiting for Nobu, I began to wonder if he was really coming. I knew I shouldn't do it, but I laid my head down on the table to rest, for I'd slept poorly these past nights. I didn't fall asleep, but I did drift for a time in my general sense of misery. And then I seemed to have a most peculiar dream. I thought I heard the tapping sound of drums in the distance, and a hiss like water from a faucet, and then I felt the chairman's hand touching my shoulder. I knew it was the chairman's hand because when I lifted my head from the table to see who had touched me, he was there. The tapping had been his footsteps, the hissing was the door in its track, and now he stood above me with the maid waiting behind him. I bowed and apologized for falling asleep. I felt so confused that for a moment I wondered if it was really him, if I was really awake. But it wasn't a dream. The chairman was seating himself on the very cushion where I'd expected Nobu to sit, and yet Nobu was nowhere to be seen. While the maid placed sake on the table, an awful thought began to take hold in my mind. Had the chairman come to tell me Nobu had been in an accident, or that some other horrible thing had happened to him? Otherwise, why hadn't Nobu himself come? I was about to ask the chairman when the mistress of the tea house peered into the room. "Why, chairman," she said, "we haven't seen you in weeks." The mistress was always pleasant in front of guests, but I could tell from the strain in her voice that she had something else on her mind. Probably she was wondering about Nobu just as I was. While I poured sake for the chairman, the mistress came and knelt at the table. She stopped his hand before he took a sip from his cup and leaned toward him to breathe in the scent of the vapors. "Really, chairman, I'll never understand why you prefer this sake to others," she said. "We opened some this afternoon, the best we've had in years. I'm sure Nobu-san will appreciate it when he arrives." "I'm sure he would," the chairman said. "Nobu appreciates fine things, but he won't be coming tonight." I was alarmed to hear this, but I kept my eyes to the table. I could see that the mistress was surprised too, because of how quickly she changed the subject. "Oh well," she said. "Anyway, don't you think our Sayuri looks charming this evening?" "Now, mistress, when has Sayuri not looked charming?" said the chairman. "Which reminds me, let me show you something I've brought." The chairman put onto the table a little bundle wrapped in blue silk. I hadn't noticed it in his hand when he'd entered the room. He untied it and took out a short, fat scroll which he began to unroll. It was cracked with age and showed, in miniature, brilliantly colored scenes of the imperial court. If you've ever seen this sort of scroll, you'll know that you can unroll it all the way across a room and survey the entire grounds of the imperial compound, from the gates at one end to the palace at the other. The chairman sat with it before him, unrolling it from one spindle to the other, past scenes of drinking parties and aristocrats playing kickball with their kimonos cinched up between their legs, until he came to a young woman in her lovely 12-layered robes kneeling on the wood floor outside the emperor's chambers. "Now, what do you think of that?" he said. "It's quite a scroll," the mistress said. "Where did the chairman find it?" "Oh, I bought it years ago, but look at this woman right here. She's the reason I bought it. Don't you notice anything about her?" The mistress peered at it. Afterward, the chairman turned it for me to see. The image of the young woman, though no bigger than a large coin, was painted in exquisite detail. I didn't notice it at first, but her eyes were pale, and when I looked more closely, I saw they were blue-gray. They made me think at once of the works Ushida had painted using me as a model. I blushed and muttered something about how beautiful the scroll was. The mistress admired it too for a moment, and then said, "Well, I'll leave the two of you. I'm going to send up some of that fresh chilled sake I mentioned, unless you think I should save it for the next time Nobu-san comes." "Don't bother," he said. "We'll make do with the sake we have." "Nobu-san is quite all right, isn't he?" "Oh, yes," said the chairman, "quite all right." I was relieved to hear this, but at the same time I felt myself growing sick with shame. If the chairman hadn't come to give me news about Nobu, he'd come for some other reason, probably to berate me for what I'd done. In the few days since returning to Kyoto, I'd tried not to imagine what he must have seen. The minister with his pants undone, me with my bare legs protruding from my disordered kimono. When the mistress left the room, the sound of the door closing behind her was like a sword being drawn from its sheath. "May I please say, Chairman," I began as steadily as I could, "that my behavior on Amami—" "I know what you're thinking, Sayuri, but I haven't come here to ask for your apology. Sit quietly a moment. I want to tell you about something that happened quite a number of years ago." "Chairman, I feel so confused," I managed to say. "Please forgive me, but—" "Just listen. You'll understand soon enough why I'm telling it to you. Do you recall a restaurant named Tsumiyo? It closed toward the end of the Depression, but, well, never mind. You were very young at the time. In any case, one day, quite some years ago, 18 years ago to be exact, I went there for lunch with several of my associates. We were accompanied by a certain geisha named Isuko from the Pontocho district. I recognized Isuko's name at once. She was everybody's favorite back in those days, the chairman went on. We happened to finish up our lunch a bit early, so I suggested we take a stroll by the Shirakawa stream on our way to the theater. By this time, I'd removed the chairman's handkerchief from my obi, and now, silently, I spread it onto the table and smoothed it so that his monogram was clearly visible. Over the years, the handkerchief had taken on a stain in one corner, and the linen had yellowed, but the chairman seemed to recognize it at once. His words trailed off, and he picked it up. "Where did you get this?" "Chairman," I said, "all these years I've wondered if you knew I was the little girl you'd spoken to. You gave me your handkerchief that very afternoon on your way to see the play Shibaraku. You also gave me a coin." "Do you mean to say, even when you were an apprentice, you knew that I was the man who'd spoken to you?" "I recognized the chairman the moment I saw him again, at the sumo tournament. To tell the truth, I'm amazed the chairman remembered me." "Well, perhaps you ought to look at yourself in the mirror sometimes, Sayuri, particularly when your eyes are wet from crying, because they become— I can't explain it. I felt I was seeing right through them, you know. I spent so much of my time seated across from men who were never quite telling me the truth, and here was a girl who'd never laid eyes on me before, and yet was willing to let me see straight into her. And then the chairman interrupted himself. "Didn't you ever wonder why Mamea became your older sister?" he asked me. "Mamea?" I said. "I don't understand. What does Mamea have to do with it?" "You really don't know, do you?" "Know what, Chairman?" "Sayuri, I am the one who asked Mamea to take you under her care. I told her about a beautiful young girl I'd met with startling grey eyes, and asked that she help you if she ever came upon you in Gion. I said I would cover her expenses if necessary, and she did come upon you only a few months later. From what she's told me over the years, you would certainly never have become a geisha without her help." It's almost impossible to describe the effect the chairman's words had on me. I'd always taken it for granted that Mamea's mission had been personal, to rid herself, Gion, of Hatsumomo. Now that I understood her real motive, that I'd come under her tutelage because of the chairman, well, I felt I would have to look back at all the comments she'd ever made to me and wonder about the real meaning behind them. And it wasn't just Mamea who'd suddenly been transformed in my eyes. Even I seemed to myself be a different woman. When my gaze fell upon my hands in my lap, I saw them as hands the chairman had made. I felt exhilarated and frightened and grateful all at once. I moved away from the table to bow and express my gratitude to him, but before I could even do it, I had to say, "Chairman, forgive me, but I so wish that at some time years ago you could have told me about all of this. I can't say how much it would have meant to me." "There's a reason why I never could, Sayuri, and why I had to insist that Mamea not tell you either. It has to do with Nobu." To hear mention of Nobu's name, all the feeling drained out of me, for I had the sudden notion that I understood where the chairman had been leading all along. "Chairman," I said, "I know I've been unworthy of your kindness. This past weekend when I confess, Sayuri," he interrupted, "that what happened on Amami has been very much on my mind." I could feel the chairman looking at me. I couldn't possibly have looked back at him. "There's something I want to discuss with you," he went on. "I've been wondering all day how to go about it. I keep thinking of something that happened many years ago. I'm sure there must be a better way to explain myself, but I do hope you'll understand what I'm trying to say." Here he paused to take off his jacket and fold it on the mats beside him. I could smell the starch in his shirt, which made me think of visiting the general at the Suruya Inn and his room that often smelled of ironing. "Back when Iwamura Electric was still a young company," the chairman began, "I came to know a man named Ikeda, who worked for one of our suppliers on the other side of town. He was a genius at solving wiring problems. Sometimes, when we had difficulty with an installation, we asked to borrow him for a day, and he straightened everything out for us. Then, one afternoon when I was rushing home from work, I happened to run into him at the pharmacist. He told me he was feeling very relaxed because he'd quit his job. When I asked him why he'd done it, he said, 'The time came to quit, so I quit.' Well, I hired him right there on the spot. Then a few weeks later, I asked him again, 'Ikeda-san, why did you quit your job across town?' He said to me, 'Mr. Iwamura, for years I wanted to come and work for your company, but you never asked me. You always called on me when you had a problem, but you never asked me to work for you. Then, one day, I realized that you never would ask me, because you didn't want to hire me away from one of your suppliers and jeopardize your business relationship. Only if I quit my job first would you then have the opportunity to hire me. So I quit. I knew the chairman was waiting for me to respond, but I didn't dare speak. Now, I've been thinking, he went on, that perhaps your encounter with the minister was like Ikeda quitting his job. And I'll tell you why this thought. Chairman, please, I began unsteadily. I made such a terrible mistake, such a terrible mistake. Before you say anything further, I only want to know why you did this thing. Perhaps you felt you were doing Iwamura Electric some sort of favor. I don't know. Or maybe you owed the minister something I'm unaware of. I must have given my head a little shake, because the chairman stopped speaking at once. I'm deeply ashamed, Chairman, I managed to say at last, but my motives were purely personal. After a long moment, he sighed and held out his sake cup. I poured for him, with the feeling that my hands were someone else's, and then he tossed the sake into his mouth and held it there before swallowing. Seeing him with his mouth momentarily full made me think of myself as an empty vessel swelled up with shame. All right, Sayuri, he said, I'll tell you exactly why I'm asking. It will be impossible for you to grasp why I've come here tonight, or why I've treated you as I have over the years, if you don't understand the nature of my relationship with Nobu. Believe me, I'm more aware than anyone of how difficult he can sometimes be. But he is a genius. I value him more than an entire team of men combined. I couldn't think of what to do or say, so with trembling hands, I picked up the vial to pour more sake for the chairman. I took it as a very bad sign that he didn't lift his cup. One day, when I'd known you only a short time, he went on, Nobu brought you a gift of a comb and gave it to you in front of everyone at the party. I hadn't realized how much affection he felt for you until that very moment. I'm sure there were other signs before, but somehow I must have overlooked them. And when I realized how he felt, the way he looked at you that evening, well, I knew in a moment that I couldn't possibly take away from him the thing he so clearly wanted. It never diminished my concern for your welfare. In fact, as the years have gone by, it has become increasingly difficult for me to listen dispassionately while Nobu talks about you. Here, the chairman paused and said, Sayuri, are you listening to me? Yes, Chairman, of course. There's no reason you would know this, but I owe Nobu a great debt. It's true I'm the founder of the company and his boss, but when Imamura Electric was still quite young, we had a terrible problem with cash flow and very nearly went out of business. I wasn't willing to give up control of the company, and I wouldn't listen to Nobu when he insisted on bringing in investors. He won in the end, even though it caused a rift between us for a time. He offered to resign, and I almost let him. But of course he was completely right and I was wrong. I'd have lost the company without him. How do you repay a man for something like that? Do you know why I'm called Chairman and not President? It's because I resigned the title so Nobu would take it, though he tried to refuse. This is why I made up my mind, the moment I became aware of his affection for you, that I would keep my interest in you hidden so that Nobu could have you. Life has been cruel to him, Sayuri. He's had too little kindness. In all my years as a geisha, I'd never been able to convince myself even for a moment that the chairman felt any special regard for me. And now, to know that he'd intended me for... I never meant to pay you so little attention, he went on. But surely you realize that if he'd ever picked up the slightest hint of my feelings, he would have given you up in an instant. Since my girlhood, I'd dreamed that one day the chairman would tell me he cared for me, and yet I'd never quite believed it would really happen. I certainly hadn't imagined he might tell me what I hoped to hear, and also that Nobu was my destiny. Perhaps the goal I'd sought in my life would elude me, but at least during this one moment, it was within my power to sit in the room with the chairman and tell him how deeply I felt. "Please, forgive me for what I'm about to say," I finally managed to begin. I tried to continue, but somehow my throat made up its mind to swallow, though I can't think what I was swallowing unless it was a little knot of emotion I pushed back down, because there was no room in my face for any more. "I have great affection for Nobu, but what I did on Amami—" Here I had to hold the burning in my throat a long moment before I could speak again. "What I did on Amami, I did because of my feelings for you, Chairman. Every step I have taken in my life, since I was a child in Kion, I have taken in the hope of bringing myself closer to you." When I said these words, all the heat in my body seemed to rise to my face. I felt I might float up into the air, just like a piece of ash from a fire, unless I could focus on something in the room. I tried to find a smudge on the tabletop, but already the table itself was glazing over and disappearing in my vision. "Look at me, Sayuri." I wanted to do as the chairman asked, but I couldn't. How strange, he went on quietly, almost to himself, that the same woman who looked me so frankly in the eye as a girl many years ago can't bring herself to do it now. Perhaps it ought to have been a simple task to raise my eyes and look at the chairman, and yet somehow I couldn't have felt more nervous if I'd stood alone on a stage with all of Kyoto watching. We were sitting at a corner of the table, so close that when at length I wiped my eyes and raised them to meet his, I could see the dark rings around his irises. I wondered if perhaps I should look away and make a little bow, and then offer to pour him a cup of sake, but no gesture would have been enough to break the tension. As I was thinking these thoughts, the chairman moved the vial of sake and the cup aside, and then reached out his hand and took the collar of my robe to draw me toward him. In a moment our faces were so close, I could feel the warmth of his skin. I was still struggling to understand what was happening to me and what I ought to do or say, and then the chairman pulled me closer and he kissed me. It may surprise you to hear that this was the first time in my life anyone had ever really kissed me. General Totori had sometimes pressed his lip against mine when he was my Dana, but it had been utterly passionless. I'd wondered at the time if he simply needed somewhere to rest his face. Even Yasuda Akira, the man who'd brought me a kimono and whom I'd seduced one night at the Tatematsu tea house, must have kissed me dozens of times on my neck and face, but he never really touched my lips with his. And so you can imagine that this kiss, the first real one of my life, seemed to me more intimate than anything I'd ever experienced. I had the feeling I was taking something from the chairman, and that he was giving something to me, something more private than anyone had ever given me before. There was a certain very startling taste, as distinctive as any fruit or sweet, and when I tasted it, my shoulders sagged and my stomach swelled up, because for some reason it called to me a dozen different scenes I could think while I should remember. I thought of the head of steam when the cook lifted the lid from the rice cooker in the kitchen of our Okiya. I saw a picture in my mind of the little alleyway that was the main thoroughfare of Pontocho, as I'd seen it one evening crowded with well-wishers after Kishisaburo's last performance, the day he'd retired from the Kabuki theater. I'm sure I might have thought of 100 other things, for it was as if all the boundaries in my mind had broken down and my memories were running free. But then the chairman leaned back away from me again, with one of his hands upon my neck. He was so close I could see the moisture glistening on his lip, and still smell the kiss which just ended. "Chairman," I said. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why, everything. Why have you kissed me? You've just been speaking of me as a gift to Nobu-san." "Nobu gave you up, Sayuri. I've taken nothing away from him." In my confusion of feelings, I couldn't quite understand what he meant. "When I saw you there with the minister, you had a look in your eyes just like the one I saw so many years ago at the Shirakawa stream," he told me. "You seemed so desperate, like you might drown if someone didn't save you. After Pumpkin told me you'd intended that encounter for Nobu's eyes, I made up my mind to tell him what I'd seen. And when he reacted so angrily, well, if he couldn't forgive you for what you'd done, it was clear to me he was never truly your destiny." One afternoon back, when I was a child in Yoruido, a little boy named Gizuke climbed the tree to jump into the pond. He climbed much higher than he should have. The water wasn't deep enough. But when we told him not to jump, he was afraid to climb back down because of rocks under the tree. I ran to the village to find his father, Mr. Yamashita, who came walking so calmly up the hill I wondered if he realized what danger his son was in. He stepped underneath the tree just as the boy, unaware of his father's presence, lost his grip and fell. Mr. Yamashita caught him as easily as if someone had dropped a sack into his arms and set him upright. We all of us cried out in delight and skipped around at the edge of the pond while Gizuke stood blinking his eyes very quickly, little tears of astonishment gathering on his lashes. Now I knew exactly what Gizuke must have felt. I had been plummeting toward the rocks, and the chairman had stepped out to catch me. I was so overcome with relief, I couldn't even wipe away the tears that spilled from the corners of my eyes. His shape was a blur before me, but I could see him moving closer, and in a moment he'd gathered me up in his arms just as if I were a blanket. His lips went straight for the little triangle of flesh where the edges of my kimono came together at my throat. And when I felt his breath on my neck and the sense of urgency with which he almost consumed me, I couldn't help thinking of a moment years earlier when I'd stepped into the kitchen of the Okiya and found one of the maids leaning over the sink, trying to cover up the ripe pear she held to her mouth, its juices running down onto her neck. She'd had such a craving for it, she'd said, and begged me not to tell Mother. Love, love, love. Chapter 35. Now, nearly 40 years later, I sit here looking back on that evening with the chairman as the moment when all the grieving voices within me fell silent. Since the day I'd left Yoruido, I'd done nothing but worry that every turn of life's wheel would bring yet another obstacle into my path. And of course, it was the worrying and the struggle that had always made life so vividly real to me. When we fight upstream against a rocky undercurrent, every foothold takes on a kind of urgency. But life softened into something much more pleasant after the chairman became my Dana. I began to feel like a tree whose roots had at last broken into the rich, wet soil deep beneath the surface. I'd never before had occasion to think of myself as more fortunate than others, and yet now I was. Though I must say, I lived in that contented state a long while before I was finally able to look back and admit how desolate my life had once been. I'm sure I could never have told my story otherwise. I don't think any of us can speak frankly about pain until we are no longer enduring it. On the afternoon when the chairman and I drank sake together in a ceremony at the Ishiriki tea house, something peculiar happened. I don't know why, but when I sipped from the smallest of the 3 cups we used, I let the sake wash over my tongue, and a single drop of it spilled from the corner of my mouth. I was wearing a 5-crested kimono of black, with a dragon woven in gold and red encircling the hem up to my thighs. I recall watching the drop fall beneath my arm and roll down the black silk on my thigh until it came to a stop at the heavy silver threads of the dragon's teeth. I'm sure most geisha would call it a bad omen that I'd spilled sake, but to me, that droplet of moisture that had slipped from me like a tear seemed almost to tell the story of my life. It fell through empty space with no control whatsoever over its destiny, rolled along a path of silk, and somehow came to rest there on the teeth of that dragon. I thought of the paddles I'd thrown into the Kamo River shallows outside Mr. Arashino's workshop, imagining they might find their way to the chairman. It seemed to me that somehow, perhaps they had. In the foolish hopes that had been so dear to me since girlhood, I'd always imagined my life would be perfect if I ever became the chairman's mistress. It's a childish thought, and yet I'd carried it with me even as an adult. I ought to have known better. How many times already had I encountered the painful lesson that although we may wish for the barbs to be pulled from our flesh, it leaves behind a welt that doesn't heal. In banishing Nobu from my life forever, it wasn't just that I lost his friendship. I also ended up banishing myself from Gion. The reason is so simple, I ought to have known beforehand it would happen. A man who has won a prize coveted by his friend faces a difficult choice. He must either hide his prize away where the friend will never see it, if he can, or suffer damage to the friendship. This was the very problem that had arisen between Pumpkin and me. Our friendship had never recovered after my adoption. So although the chairman's negotiations with Mother to become my Dana dragged out over several months, in the end it was agreed that I would no longer work as a geisha. I certainly wasn't the first geisha to leave Gion. Besides those who ran away, some married and left as wives. Others withdrew to set up tea houses or okiya of their own. In my case, however, I was trapped in a peculiar middle ground. The chairman wanted me out of Gion to keep me out of sight of Nobu, but he certainly wasn't going to marry me. He was already married. Probably the perfect solution, and the one that the chairman proposed, would have been to set me up with my own tea house or inn, one that Nobu would never have visited. But Mother was unwilling to have me leave the okiya. She would have earned no revenues from my relationship with the chairman if I had ceased to be a member of the Nita family, you see. This is why, in the end, the chairman agreed to pay the okiya a very considerable sum each month on the condition that Mother permit me to end my career. I continued to live in the okiya, just as I had for so many years, but I no longer went to the little school in the mornings or made the rounds of Gion to pay my respects on special occasions. And of course, I no longer entertained during the evenings. Because I'd set my sights on becoming a geisha only to win the affections of the chairman, probably I ought to have felt no sense of loss in withdrawing from Gion. And yet, over the years I'd developed many rich friendships, not only with other geisha, but with many of the men I'd come to know. I wasn't banished from the company of other women just because I'd ceased entertaining, but those who make a living in Gion have little time for socializing. And I often felt jealous when I saw 2 geisha hurrying to their next engagement, laughing together over what had happened at the last one. I didn't envy them the uncertainty of their existence, but I did envy that sense of promise I could well remember, that the evening ahead might yet hold some mischievous pleasure. I did see Mamiya frequently. We had tea together at least several times a week. Considering all that she had done for me since childhood, and the special role she'd played in my life on the chairman's behalf, you can imagine how much I felt myself in her debt. One day in a shop I came upon a silk painting from the 18th century showing a woman teaching a young girl calligraphy. The teacher had an exquisite oval face and watched over her pupil with such benevolence, it made me think of Mamea at once, and I bought it for her as a gift. On the rainy afternoon when she hung it on the wall of her dreary apartment, I found myself listening to the traffic that hissed by on Higashi-Oji Avenue. I couldn't help remembering, with a terrible feeling of loss, her elegant apartment from years earlier, and the enchanting sound of those windows of water rushing over the knee-high cascade in the Shirakawa stream. Gion itself had seemed to me like an exquisite piece of antique fabric back then, but so much had changed. Now Mamea's simple one-room apartment had mats the color of stale tea and smelled of herbal potions from the Chinese pharmacy below, so much so that her kimono themselves sometimes gave off a faint medicinal odor. After she'd hung the ink painting on the wall and admired it for a while, she came back to the table. She sat with her hands around her steaming teacup, peering into it as though she expected to find the words she was looking for. I was surprised to see the tendons in her hands beginning to show themselves from age. At last, with a trace of sadness, she said, "How curious it is what the future brings us. You must take care, Sayuri, never to expect too much." I'm quite sure she was right. I'd have had an easier time over the following years if I hadn't gone on believing that Nobu would one day forgive me. In the end, I had to give up questioning Mamea whether he'd asked about me. It pained me terribly to see her sigh and give me a long, sad look, as if to say she was sorry I hadn't known better than to hope for such a thing. In the spring of the year after I became his mistress, the chairman purchased a luxurious house in the northeast of Kyoto and named it Aishin-an, Prosperous Truth Retreat. It was intended for guests of the company, but in fact the chairman made more use of it than anyone. This was where he and I met to spend the evenings together 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes even more. On his busiest days, he arrived so late he wanted only to soak in a hot bath while I talked with him, and then afterward fall asleep. But most evenings he arrived around sunset or soon after, and ate his dinner while we chatted and watched the servants light the lanterns in the garden. Usually, when he first came, the chairman talked for a time about his workday. He might tell me about troubles with a new product, or about a traffic accident involving a truckload of pans, or some such thing. Of course, I was happy to sit and listen, but I understood perfectly well that the chairman wasn't telling these things to me because he wanted me to know them. He was clearing them from his mind, just like draining water from a bucket. So I listened closely not to his words, but to the tone of his voice, because in the same way that sound rises as a bucket is emptied, I could hear the chairman's voice softening as he spoke. When the moment was right, I changed the subject, and soon we were talking about nothing so serious as business, but about everything else instead, such as what had happened to him that morning on the way to work, or something about the film we may have watched a few nights earlier there at the Aishin-an. Or perhaps I told him a funny story I might have heard from Mamea, who on some evenings came to join us there. In any case, this simple process of first draining the chairman's mind and then relaxing him with playful conversation had the same effect water has on a towel that has dried stiffly in the sun. When he first arrived and I washed his hands with a hot cloth, his fingers felt rigid, like heavy twigs. After we had talked for a time, they bent as gracefully as if he were sleeping. I expected that this would be my life, entertaining the chairman in the evenings and occupying myself during the daylight hours in any way I could. But in the fall of 1952, I accompanied the chairman on his second trip to the United States. He'd traveled there the winter before, and no experience of his life had ever made such an impression on him. He said he felt understood for the first time the true meaning of prosperity. Most Japanese at this time had electricity only during certain hours, for example, but the lights in American cities burned around the clock. And while we in Kyoto were proud that the floor of our new train station was constructed of concrete rather than old-fashioned wood, the floors of American train stations were made of solid marble. Even in small American towns, the movie theaters were as grand as our national theater, said the chairman, and the public bathrooms everywhere were spotlessly clean. What amazed him most of all was that every family in the United States owned a refrigerator, which could be purchased with the wages earned by an average worker in only a month's time. In Japan, a worker needed 15 months' wages to buy such a thing. Few families could afford it. In any case, as I say, the chairman permitted me to accompany him on his second trip to America. I traveled alone by rail to Tokyo, and from there we flew together on an airplane bound for Hawaii, where we spent a few remarkable days. The chairman bought me a bathing suit, the first I'd ever owned, and I sat wearing it on the beach with my hair hanging neatly at my shoulders just like other women around me. Hawaii reminded me strangely of Amami. I worried that the same thought might occur to the chairman, but if it did, he said nothing about it. From Hawaii, we continued to Los Angeles and finally to New York. I knew nothing about the United States except what I'd seen in movies. I don't think I quite believed that the great buildings of New York City really existed. And when I settled at last into my room at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and looked out the window at the mountainous buildings around me and the smooth, clean streets below, I had the feeling I was seeing a world in which anything was possible. I confess, I'd expected to feel like a baby who has been taken away from its mother, for I had never before left Japan and couldn't imagine that a setting as alien as New York City would make me anything but fearful. Perhaps it was the chairman's enthusiasm that helped me to approach my visit there with such goodwill. He'd taken a separate room, which he used mostly for business, but every night he came to stay with me in the suite he'd arranged. Often I awoke in that strange bed and turned to see him there in the dark, sitting in a chair by the window holding the sheer curtain open, staring at Park Avenue below. One time, after 2 o'clock in the morning, he took me by the hand and pulled me to the window to see a young couple dressed as if they'd come from a ball, kissing under the street lamp on the corner. Over the next 3 years, I traveled with the chairman twice more to the United States. While he attended to business during the day, my maid and I took in the museums and restaurants, and even a ballet, which I found breathtaking. Strangely, one of the few Japanese restaurants we were able to find in New York was now under the management of a chef I'd known well in Gion before the war. During lunch one afternoon, I found myself in his private room in the back, entertaining a number of men I hadn't seen in years. The vice president of Nippon Telephone and Telegraph, the new Japanese consul general, who had formerly been mayor of Kobe, a professor of political science from Kyoto University. It was almost like being back in Gion once again. In the summer of 1956, the chairman, who had 2 daughters by his wife but no son, arranged for his eldest daughter to marry a man named Nishioka Minoru. The chairman's intention was that Mr. Nishioka take the family name of Iwamura and become his heir. But at the last moment, Mr. Nishioka had a change of heart and informed the chairman that he did not intend to go through with the wedding. He was a very temperamental young man, but in the chairman's estimation, quite brilliant. For a week or more, the chairman was upset and snapped at his servants and me without the least provocation. I'd never seen him so disturbed by anything. No one ever told me why Nishioka Minoru changed his mind, but no one had to. During the previous summer, the founder of one of Japan's largest insurance companies had dismissed his son as president and turned his company over instead to a much younger man, his illegitimate son by a Tokyo geisha. It caused quite a scandal at the time. Things of this sort had happened before in Japan, but usually on a much smaller scale, in family-owned kimono stores or sweet shops, businesses of that sort. The insurance company director described his firstborn in the newspapers as an earnest young man whose talents unfortunately can't be compared with, and here he named his illegitimate son, without ever giving any hint of their relationship. But it made no difference whether he gave a hint of it or not. Everyone knew the truth soon enough. Now, if you were to imagine that Nishioko Minoru, after already having agreed to become the chairman's heir, had discovered some new bit of information, such as that the chairman had recently fathered an illegitimate son, well, I'm sure that in this case, his reluctance to go through with the marriage would probably seem quite understandable. It was widely known that the chairman lamented having no son and was deeply attached to his own two daughters. Was there any reason to think he wouldn't become equally attached to an illegitimate son? Enough, perhaps, to change his mind before death and turn over to him the company he'd built? As to the question of whether or not I really had given birth to a son of the chairman's, if I had, I'd certainly be reluctant to talk too much about him, for fear that his identity might become publicly known. It would be in no one's best interest for such a thing to happen. The best course, I feel, is for me to say nothing at all. I'm sure you will understand. A week or so after Nishioka Minoru's change of heart, I decided to raise a very delicate subject with the chairman. We were at the Eishinan, sitting outdoors after dinner on the veranda overlooking the moss garden. The chairman was brooding and hadn't spoken a word since before dinner was served. "Have I mentioned to Dana-sama," I began, "that I've had the strangest feeling lately?" I glanced at him, but I could see no sign that he was even listening. "I keep thinking of the Shiriki tea house," I went on, "and truthfully, I'm beginning to recognize how much I miss entertaining." The chairman just took a bite of his ice cream and then set his spoon down on the dish again. "Of course, I can never go back to work in Gion. I know that perfectly well, and yet I wonder, Dana-sama, isn't there a place for a small tea house in New York City?" "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "There's no reason why you should want to leave Japan." "Japanese businessmen and politicians are showing up in New York these days as commonly as turtles plopping into a pond," I said. "Most of them are men I've known already for years. It's true that leaving Japan would be an abrupt change, but considering that Dana-sama will be spending more and more of his time in the United States, I knew this was true because he'd already told me about his plan to open a branch of his company there. "I'm in no mood for this, Sayuri," he began. I think he intended to say something further, but I went on as though I hadn't heard him. "They say that a child raised between two cultures often has a very difficult time," I said. "So naturally, a mother who moves with her child to a place like the United States would probably be wise to make it her permanent home." "Sayuri, which is to say," I went on, "that a woman who made such a choice would probably never bring her child back to Japan at all." By this time, the chairman must have understood what I suggested, that I remove from Japan the only obstacle in the way of Nishioka Minoru's adoption as his heir. He wore a startled look for an instant, and then, probably as the image formed in his mind of my leaving him, his peevish humor seemed to crack open like an egg, and out of the corner of his eye came a single tear, which he blinked away just as swiftly as swatting a fly. In August of that same year, I moved to New York City to set up my own very small tea house for Japanese businessmen and politicians traveling through the United States. Of course, Mother tried to ensure that any business I started in New York City would be an extension of the Nitaokiya, but the chairman refused to consider any such arrangement. Mother had power over me as long as I remained in Gion, but I broke my ties with her by leaving. The chairman sent in 2 of his accountants to ensure that Mother gave me every last yen to which I was entitled. I can't pretend I didn't feel afraid so many years ago, when the door of my apartment here at the Waldorf Towers closed behind me for the first time. But New York is an exciting city. Before long, It came to feel at least as much a home to me as Guillaume ever did. In fact, as I look back, the memories of many long weeks I've spent here with the chairman have made my life in the United States even richer in some ways than it was in Japan. My little tea house on the second floor of an old club off Fifth Avenue was modestly successful from the very beginning. A number of geisha have come from Gion to work with me there, and even Mamea sometimes visits. Nowadays I go there myself only when close friends or old acquaintances have come to town. I spend my time in a variety of other ways instead. In the mornings, I often join a group of Japanese writers and artists from the area to study subjects that interest us, such as poetry or music, or during 1 month-long session, the history of New York City. I lunch with a friend most days, and in the afternoons I kneel before my makeup stand to prepare for one party or another, sometimes here in my very own apartment. When I lift the brocade cover on my mirror, I can't help but remember the milky odor of the white makeup I so often wore in Gion. I dearly wish I could go back there to visit, but on the other hand, I think I would be disturbed to see all the changes. When friends bring photographs from their trips to Kyoto, I often think that Gion has thinned out like a poorly kept garden, increasingly overrun with weeds. After Mother's death a number of years ago, for example, the Nita Okiya was torn down and replaced with a tiny concrete building housing a bookshop on the ground floor and 2 apartments overhead. 800 geisha worked in Gion when I first arrived there. Now, the number is less than 60, with only a handful of apprentices, and it dwindles further every day, because of course the pace of change never slows, even when we've convinced ourselves it will. On his last visit to New York City, the chairman and I took a walk through Central Park. We happened to be talking about the past, and when we came to a path through pine trees, the chairman stopped suddenly. He'd often told me of the pines bordering the street outside Osaka on which he'd grown up. I knew as I watched him that he was remembering them. He stood with his 2 frail hands on his cane and his eyes closed, and breathed in deeply the scent of the past. "Sometimes," he sighed, "I think the things I remember are more real than the things I see." As a younger woman, I believed that passion must surely fade with age, just as a cup left standing in a room will gradually give up its contents to the air. But when the chairman and I returned to my apartment, we drank each other up with so much yearning and need that afterward I felt myself drained of all the things the chairman had taken from me, and yet filled with all that I had taken from him. I fell into a sound sleep and dreamed that I was at a banquet back in Gion, talking with an elderly man who was explaining to me that his wife, whom he'd cared for deeply, wasn't really dead, because the pleasure of their time together lived on inside him. While he spoke these words, I drank from a bowl of the most extraordinary soup I've ever tasted. Every briny sip was a kind of ecstasy. I began to feel that all the people I'd ever known who had died or left me had not in fact gone away, but continued to live on inside me, just as this man's wife lived on inside him. I felt as though I were drinking them all in. My sister Satsu, who had run away and left me so young, my father and mother, Mr. Tanaka with his perverse view of kindness, Nobu, who could never forgive me, even the chairman. The soup was filled with all that I'd ever cared for in my life, and while I drank it, this man spoke his words right into my heart. I awoke with tears streaming down my temples, and I took the chairman's hand, fearing that I would never be able to live without him when he died and left me. For he was so frail by then, even there in his sleep, that I couldn't help thinking of my mother back in Yoruido. And yet, when his death happened only a few months later, I understood that he left me at the end of his long life just as naturally as the leaves fall from the trees. I cannot tell you what it is that guides us in this life, but for me, I fell toward the chairman just as a stone must fall toward the earth. When I cut my lip and met Mr. Tanaka, when my mother died and I was cruelly sold, it was all like a stream that falls over rocky cliffs before it can reach the ocean. Even now that he is gone, I have him still in the richness of my memories. I've lived my life again just telling it to you. It's true that sometimes when I cross Park Avenue, I'm struck with the peculiar sense of how exotic my surroundings are. The yellow taxicabs that go sweeping past, honking their horns. The women with their briefcases who look so perplexed to see a little old Japanese woman standing on the street corner in kimono. But really, would Yoroido seem any less exotic if I went back there again? As a young girl, I believed my life would never have been a struggle if Mr. Tanaka hadn't torn me away from my tipsy house. But now I know that our world is no more permanent than a wave rising on the ocean. Whatever our struggles and triumphs, however we may suffer them, all too soon they bleed into a wash, just like watery ink on paper. It was my honor reading to you. I hope you enjoyed this beautiful book. And I see you tomorrow with a new one. Be curious. Be safe. Bye.